Japan has been on the path to demographic oblivion for more than 5 decades. Extreme urbanization has been the norm since World War II, and there simply isn't enough space in Tokyo's omnipresent condos to easily raise families, much less families of size. The aging process is so deeply entrenched that some 30,000 Japanese die in their apartments every year without anyone noticing, until there's a smell necessitating fumigation. Japan passed the point of no return in its demographic structure back in the 1990s. But rather than crawl into a hole and die, the Japanese government and corporate world have long since branched out in ways that reflect the country's underlying demographic weaknesses and strengths. Japanese firms realize their local demographics are wretched, but they also realize that building products en masse at home requires young workers that they no longer have, and that dumping said products on other markets is often considered as somewhat rude. So the Japanese have opted for something new: de-sourcing. Japanese firms have relocated much of their industrial productive capacity to other countries, where they use more abundant local workers to produce the goods that are then sold into those same local markets. Then some of the income from those sales flows back to Japan to sustain the ever-aging Japanese population. Design and technical and very high-end manufacturing work, the sort of work done by high-skilled, older workers, is kept in Japan. But almost the entirety of the rest of the manufacturing supply chain is located on the other side of national borders. In essence, the Japanese read the writing on the wall in the 1980s. They saw how their American security guarantor resented product dumping and started a multi-decade effort to instead manufacture goods within their target markets. In particular, this concept of build where you sell has become Toyota's new corporate mantra. This new industrial model has enabled Japan to age with a degree of grace, but there are a couple of glaring problems. First, Japan's economy is stalled. In inflation-adjusted terms, the Japanese economy was smaller in 2019 than it was in 1995. Part and parcel of not being able to build and sell with and to your own population is that you need to move some goalposts. Even outsized economic success in a post-growth world just doesn't have much, well, growth. Second, it is exceedingly unlikely that Japan's path is replicable. After all, the Japanese experience of 1980 to 2019 is in many ways unique. Japan's transformation to a post-growth system occurred under ironclad American security cover. Tokyo never had to fear for its own physical protection at home. Contemporary America's disinterest indicates such cover will not be available for most countries. Corporate Japan faced no serious security threats abroad, in part because of the we're-all-friends-now nature of the post-Cold War environment, and in part because the Americans prevented any security threats from arising. The American departure from the world means that most countries, most trade routes, will be bereft of the sort of ironclad protection the Japanese evolved under. Japan's transformation occurred when its firms had access to global consumer markets, most notably the American market. Aging demographics aside, the American political system has turned sharply insular, and America simply is not going to be keeping the world open for trade. America certainly won't keep the world open for dumping products on the American consumer market. Japan was wildly wealthy at the beginning of its transition. In per capita terms, Japan became as wealthy as America in the late 1980s. All that industrial plant the Japanese built abroad had to be paid for, and the Japanese had to pay for it themselves. But they could pay for it themselves because while their demographics were turning, they had not turned yet. When the Japanese started desourcing in the 1990s, they still had roughly 20 years of a functional workforce to draw upon. Today, there are precious few countries who can lay claim to such a positive starting point in terms of wealth, and none have a tax base or worker capacity that will last more than a decade. Japan's population is the world's most homogeneous. with more than 98% of the population being purely, ethnically Japanese. That unity enabled social and economic transformations that would have triggered mass upheaval in more diverse populations. Japan is eminently defensible. Japan is an archipelago that has never been successfully invaded. Even the Americans were so daunted by the task of conquering the home islands that they opted to nuke Hiroshima and Nagasaki to force surrender, rather than sending the Marines into the grinder. Point being, Japan's defensive needs in a world without American overwatch are manageable, and the Japanese Navy is right-sized to the task of home defense. Finally, as with everything demographic, Japan had in spades the most critical asset: time. Economic transformation doesn't happen overnight. From the point that the old Japanese economic model broke in the 1989 stock and property market crashes, Japan had 3 decades to transition to what has become its new normal. There are precious few countries who boast the skilled labor and capital to attempt desourcing like the Japanese model. Denmark, the Netherlands, the United Kingdom, Singapore, South Korea, and Taiwan come to mind. The European states on the list might be able to look after their own security with limited American help, or perhaps a partnership with a more demographically stable France. As to the Asian states, they might be able to throw themselves at none other than Japan's mercy for their security overwatch. But for all of them, it would be a crapshoot as to where they'd desource to. To a degree, the Western Europeans who formed the original core of the European Union have tried this strategy with Central Europeans whom they admitted to the Union in the 2000s. But on average, the Central Europeans are aging even faster than the Western Europeans, so this strategy will collapse under its own weight in the 2020s. The Asian Tigers have the possibility of desourcing to the Southeast Asian nations, and indeed some of that has already occurred. But none of them have the military capacity to sustain such a relationship without extensive external assistance. With the notable exception of the United States, any country with a reasonably healthy demographic is more likely to be an economic and/or security competitor, and therefore an unwise destination for their investment funds. Shifting to a new system was always going to be painful, and most countries simply were never going to make the cut. But then, suddenly, tragically, horribly. Like most other countries, Mexico is under assault by the 3 trends that will make up the New World: shifting trade patterns, inverting demographics, and spasming energy patterns. In Mexico's case, the resultant changes are almost completely positive, but there is still a dark side, and it will not be contained within Mexico's borders. Mexican geography is wretched. From an economic and political point of view, the country is far more fractured than even what the Canadians have had to contend with. Mexico has no navigable rivers whatsoever. Much of its territory is fully tropical or hard desert. Worse, nearly all of Mexico, whether temperate, jungle, or desert, is mountainous as well. Jungles are the worst biome from an economic development point of view. The unrelenting heat and humidity of jungle territories provides an endless array of biological diversity, including an endless array of diseases and disease vectors. The seasonal frosts and freezes of temperate climes not only inhibit the spreads of various pathogens, but also tend to kill off the insects that carry them. People living in the tropics have no such luck. High heat and humidity exacts a constant toll on infrastructure from roads to buildings. Maintenance costs tend toward the extreme because builders must choose between having to replace everything more often or using different and more expensive materials in construction. Then there is the simple fact that the basic technologies of modern road building, the use of heavy machinery and the drying of concrete, are rather hard to manage in a downpour. Asphalt softens on a hot day, and the tropics have hot to spare. Tropical soils are very thin and shallow, only retaining their fertility when they are part of a natural biome. That fertility comes from the constant recycling of the jungle's myriad plant species, and the process of clearing land for agriculture guts the cycle. Former jungles and rainforest lands, therefore, require constant fertilization to maintain agricultural production, even for tropical crops like bananas and yams. And if surrounding jungle lands are not cleared as well, then heavy pesticide use is a must, raising costs further even as water quality declines. Often the tropics boast higher annual production totals per acre than temperate climes because the heat and sun of the tropics frequently support more than one crop cycle a year. But that increased output comes at the cost of radically increased inputs. So more foodstuffs, yes, but the overall production is generally among the least efficient in the world. There are very few places on Earth where those farming the former jungle are not mired in poverty, and Mexico is no exception. Counteracting the effects of its tropical climate is Mexico's first challenge. The Mexicans addressed this by going uphill. Higher elevation mitigates heat and humidity, soil fertility has higher potential, and the cooler temperatures and thinner air work against diseases and their vectors. Most of Mexico's population, and all but 4 of its major cities, are nestled in the multitude of plateaus, highland basins, and mountain valleys throughout the country's midsection, where the elevation lifts the land out of the tropics into a more temperate environment. But that simply replaces the tropical challenge with a mountain challenge. Mountains, by definition, don't sport large tracts of flat land. There is no Mexican equivalent of the American Midwest that has the ability to generate scads of capital or support massive populations. Unlike other locations in North America, not one Mexican urban region has a hinterland. Chicago and St. Louis have the entire Midwest, New York City the Hudson Valley and Long Island, Orlando all of Central Florida, and the cities of the coastal Southeast can draw upon the Piedmont. But when one leaves Mexico's highland valleys, one either hits deserts or jungles or mountains, or more likely, mountainous desert or mountainous jungle. Each mountain valley is limited in size and is more or less on its own. Any infrastructure that benefits one region cannot be extended to synergize with another. It must be rebuilt in each and every region without contributing to a greater whole. Mexico isn't split into 5 sections like Canada, but instead dozens, most of which cannot independently generate meaningful economies of scale. By far, Mexico's largest highland enclave is the greater Mexico City metropolitan area, home to 1 in 5 Mexicans and built on landfill. It isn't so much a good location as it is the best that the Mexican geography has on offer. Beyond Mexico City, only 10 Mexican metro areas pass the 1 million mark, break 5 million. The United States has 10. The economies of scale, abundant capital, and ease of development that the Americans take for granted and that make industrialization possible are all absent in Mexico. Transport, always the difficulty of the human condition, is more onerous in mountains than in any other terrain. Sharp elevation changes generate swift currents, meaning that not one of Mexico's rivers is navigable, naturally or otherwise. The Mexico core region of Mexico City sits at an elevation of about 8,000 feet, despite being only 200 miles inland. In comparison, Minneapolis sits at only 1/10 the elevation, despite being 7 times the distance inland. Even when Mexico's disassociated regions manage to construct some local infrastructure, links between those regions require tackling topographic verticality that is painfully daunting not just to build but also to operate. Organic consumption growth is nearly impossible because what little capital there is must be dedicated to infrastructure. But even then, basic internal distribution is nearly impossible because of the extreme operating costs. It is a recipe for disconnected poverty and fractured, ineffectual government. Such difficult terrain skews what development that can happen into decidedly inegalitarian directions. In Mexico, the only people who can make a serious go are those who already have capital to spare. Those who could afford to build the expensive road and rail necessary to link a middling patch of useful land to the coast. Those who could afford to pay workers for months or even years to clear and fertilize land so that it might one day support crops. Most Mexican territory requires irrigation, further increasing the gap between those with capital and those without. Even the climate works against economic liberty. Tropical plantation crops like bananas and coffee require a great deal of capital to establish and a mammoth amount of unskilled labor throughout the crop's life cycles to tend, harvest, and ship. In comparison, temperate crops such as wheat, barley, and corn require little labor between planting and harvest, and the actual harvesting process is fairly light on labor. You can machine harvest or even scythe and thresh in pre-industrial times, a field of wheat in a very short period of time, but each bunch of bananas has to be harvested and carefully stored by hand. When an oligarch uses his money to build a road and a plantation and maybe even a port, that oligarch finds himself quite literally the ruler of all he sees. He has applied his wealth to make something out of nothing, and he is well aware that no one who works for him could have possibly done the same. He has little interest in sharing his investments with anyone else, even another oligarch. To do so would dilute the absolute economic and political power that he holds in his own personal fiefdom. Perhaps Mexico's biggest tragedy is that when, against very expensive odds, someone does manage to make a portion of Mexico functional, that someone has every interest in resisting contributing to a broader regional or national effort to replicate the success. To do so would jeopardize not only control over the sunk investment, but also the privileged economic and political position that comes with it. Whereas the United States was settled by the poor who became rich, Mexico was settled by the rich who commanded, and still command, the poor. These factors, low capital generation from a lack of cheap transport, high capital demand from infrastructure, limited land due to topography, a political and economic system geared towards regional jefes and their plantations, sharply limit the ability of the country to urbanize, much less industrialize. Mexico's capital scarcity and extreme capital needs mean that much of the money that will be used for infrastructure development will have to come from foreign sources. And in a quick logic chain threading from geography to population patterns to transport needs to debt markets, you now understand how Mexico's regular bouts of debt crisis are both endemic and inevitable. This is how we get a famine. We have been extraordinarily lucky this year. Mother Nature has been very kind. There are record harvests throughout most of the world to compensate for the loss of Ukraine. But the damage to the fertilizer system has already been done, and we will get hit with that next year. Building new phosphate systems takes a decade. We will not recover from this quickly. And by the time we have recovered from it, we will have lost a few 100 million people. Neon. You guys have all seen Star Wars, right? Yeah, I'm sorry, wrong Star Wars. Not like lightsabers but Reagan. Back at the 1983 Reykjavik summit, Gorbachev and Reagan almost got rid of nuclear weapons. And almost on his way out the door, Gorbachev said, oh yeah, and there's just one catch to make this all happen. You have to get rid of Star Wars. And Reagan's like, nope. So it kind of fell apart, and we went from there. Gorbachev went back to the Soviet Union. It was like, okay, this is the future of great power competition, space lasers that provide a missile shield. So they didn't have the technology to do the space lasers, but it was still the Soviet Union, a lot of power, so they put a lot of effort into building out the supply chain that they would need once they stole the technology. Part of that's neon. You use neon to focus the laser aperture. Soviet Union fell apart, but not before this system was built. Today, we use neon to focus the laser apertures for semiconductor fabrication facilities. Here's the problem. The steel facilities are all in southern Russia. They're losing access to global markets because of sanctions and the war. A lot of them have shut down. The second stage facilities are all in either Odessa, which hasn't had reliable electricity in 4 months, or Mariupol, where it was leveled. We've already lost 80% of global supply. Which means that pretty soon we get to decide where we put our neon for purposes of making semiconductors. The other 20%, that's all in China. Now, China doesn't make the high-end microprocessors. They do the low end. So if you want like a margarita machine that sings when the slush is at the right churn, that's a Chinese chip. You want to do something useful, that's an American chip. And since the Chinese now control all of the world's remaining supply, what do you think they're going to prioritize? Now, the technical economic term for this sort of situation is fuck. Okay, that's a taste of the problems everyone else has to deal with. Let's talk about yours. What we've got here is a map of the physical infrastructure for the energy sector in the former Soviet space. Green is oil, red is natural gas. For starters, we're going to talk about oil, specifically the ports. These are the two facilities, Primorsk in the north, Novorossiysk in the south, that are the two largest export points for Russian and former Soviet crude. Here's the problem. The southern one is in a war zone. That makes it a little sketchy in terms of insurance. Speaking of insurance, you guys get insurance more than most crowds. You cannot have a ship go in or out of any port or any congested waterway without an insurance policy. The European Union and the United States have made it impossible for Russian chartered ships to get insurance. And as of January of next year, that applies to all Russian cargoes. which means the Russians have to self-insure their own stuff. They don't have the facilities to do that. So if one ship is hijacked, confiscated, violates an OSHA regulation, something, that's 5 million barrels a day that suddenly can't sail. And this is not Texas. This isn't even Alberta. Russian crude comes out of the permafrost. And for those of you who are from the north, not the Texans obviously, you know that in winter, as long as you're moving, you will live. But if you stop, you will freeze to death. Same thing with Russian crude in the permafrost. If the flow stops, the crude turns to gel, and the water that comes up as a byproduct freezes in the pipes. And everything from the wellhead to the pumps themselves cracks. And you have to replace the whole damn thing. The last time this happened, it was 1992, and it took the Russians 30 years to bring it all back online. They only finished last December. So we could have Latvia grab one oil tanker and this all just stops. 5 million barrels a day. Let's talk about the Chinese. On the left, the little rainbow graphic there, that's where crude comes to the Northeast Asian space. Purple is from the Americas, yellow is from West Africa, blue is from the former Soviet space, and the big old red, that's from the Persian Gulf. On the right is where West African crude goes. Orange goes, I'm colorblind all of a sudden. Green goes primarily to the European space, and then that lower one of the yellows goes primary to Asia. What has happened because of self-sanctions in Europe is the Europeans have stopped using Russian crude wherever they can, and instead they're gobbling up most of what's available out of West Africa. They're taking stuff that used to come for us, it's not a big deal for us anymore. A lot of that is light sweet, we got plenty of that. What this has done is reordered crude flows around the world. It used to be that most consumers would use the crude that was relatively proximate. That's what the refineries were designed for. Now, everything is stretched out because the Europeans are taking stuff that used to go to China, and since the Chinese are at the very end of the world's longest supply lines, they don't have the economic or military power to project out and change that, but the Europeans do, especially when it involves their former colonies. So, are the Europeans going further for crude? Yeah. Africa's farther away than the former Soviet states. But it's nothing compared to how far the Russians need to go now. Because they're now getting an extra 1 million barrels a day from Russia. It's nothing compared to what the Chinese have to do. They're now getting an extra 1 million barrels a day from the Russians, but that crude has to come out of Novorossiysk and Primorsk, go to a supertanker raft off Portugal to do sea-to-sea transfers to supertankers, and then sail the long way around Africa and Southeast Asia. The vulnerability of that system is extreme. This is several orders of magnitude more vulnerable than the supply lines we had during World War II when people were actually shooting at these things. Again, one thing goes wrong, Latvia, this all falls apart. We might push it. Here's everybody's favorite energy minister, Ms. Granholm. She made it very clear a couple weeks ago that if American refiners and gasoline and diesel distributors do not prioritize the American market, the US government will make sure that they do. Now, in the 2015 omnibus bill, President Obama gained the power for the White House to summarily end all American oil exports with a stroke of a pen. In any environment where we have a shortage of crude because of Russian losses, especially if it's 5 million, you can expect within a matter of hours that the Biden administration is going to slam the door shut on export capacity in order to keep the American market super saturated, in order to keep American crude prices more affordable. He, like his predecessor, is a populist. Now, What Granholm said she wanted actually was the refined product. She doesn't have the power to do that. Biden does not have the power to do that. But if you trap the crude in the American market and force it to just go to American refiners, it achieves most of what she's after. Is it a perfect fix? Of course not. And we know for sure that the Biden administration will approach a policy like this with deliberation and consultation, just like they do with everything else. Be ready. It's coming. Now that, of course, is going to trigger a bit of a crude mismatch. Here are all of the world's major crude grades. If you're at the top left, you're light sweet. If you're at the bottom right, you're heavy sour. Everything in blue, that's American shale. It's all super light. It's all super sweet. That is what's going to be trapped here. On the bottom right, you see the orange. That's Russian Urals. That's what we're going to lose. 5 million days of moderate heavy, moderate sour. Now, for those of you who are in the refining world and are having a heart attack right now, yes, middle distillates are going to be a bitch. You are the industry that is going to complain the most and the loudest, and reasonably so. And then you're going to realize that this is not a passing thing, and you simply have to retool and expand your distillation capacity for the crude you have access to it. Because you're still going to be able to import stuff if you want to, but you have to be able to deal with all this light sweet. So over the course of the next 3 years, you're probably going to increase refining capacity by 2 or 3 million barrels a day. And I know you're like, oh, that's impossible. Think about what the price differential for these crudes is going to be in this environment. Losing 5 million barrels of heavy sour, being stuck with 5 million barrels of light sweet in an international environment where the U.S. is no longer contributing to global supplies. You're talking about a ceiling on crude prices of 50 to 80 here and a functional floor everywhere else of 150 to 200. You are going to bitch, you are going to moan, and then you are going to expand, and then you are going to laugh. It's the greatest expansion your industry will have ever seen. Could start tomorrow based on what happens in Latvia.
Well, there's not a lot of people left in China to listen. Chairman Xi has now instituted a cult of personality that is far tighter than anything we have anywhere else in the world, and it's tighter than any cult of personality in Chinese history, including Mao. There is now a buffer between him and any information. He doesn't even have advisors that give him constant updates anymore because he's literally shot the messenger so many times that nobody wants to provide him with information. Not information that might upset him, information at all. I think the best example of that was just before the Olympics when Putin was in China. Xi met with him. It was the first world leader that Xi had met with in over 2 years. And Putin lied to his face about what was about to happen in Ukraine. And his staff didn't dare challenge Putin's words. And so Xi was apparently completely flabbergasted when the war started. And the Chinese now know that everything that they thought was true about the world is wrong. The Russians aren't as tough as they were. Their weapons don't work as well. The West is willing to stand up for countries that get invaded, not just countries, companies, boycotts. That's something they never even thought was possible. The idea that a shareholder or a consumer could pressure a company to change their global position. They now know that taking Taiwan would be harder. They know that Taiwan would have more support. If the sanctions that were put on the Russians were put on the Chinese, that would destroy the country because Russia, despite all its faults, is an energy and food exporter. China's a massive importer of all of that stuff. So it would de-civilize within a year. So everything that she thought was true, everything that the Chinese have been preparing for the last 40 years, they've been doing it wrong. And since Xi no longer has a group of smart people that he can put into a back room with some pizza and bourbon to come up with a plan B, all Xi can do is slam his head into the wall over and over and over until something cracks. And so we're seeing failure points across the entire Chinese system now. Even if Chairman Xi was to duct tape himself to a lawn chair and jump in the pool, I don't think this could be fixed, or at least not in the amount of time that China has left. Xi has been so successful with his purges that he's removed all potential leadership and intelligence capability within 2 generations of the Chinese system. And the next generation down, people aged 30 and under, have been gutted by the one-child policy. So it's a tiny group in relative terms. Some degree of disintegration of the Chinese state is now baked in, and that's before you consider the general breakdown of their economic model. The Chinese system is based on over-financing in order to shove capital into the coffers of every individual company so that they can employ people even if there's nothing for them to do. Gives people jobs so they don't rebel. But even that is dependent upon an export strategy that no longer works. China imports the vast majority of its energy or the inputs for its food system or the inputs for its manufacturing system, and then is dependent upon the sales of those manufacturers the world over. The only way China can play in that game is if the U.S. Navy encourages it, which we have been doing since 1980. All the United States has to do if the goal is to crush the Chinese is to go home. And even if the U.S. continues to play, the demographic situation combined with the cult of personality is more than enough to drive the system into the ground.
China didn't start to urbanize until 1980, and then they did it all at once. So people in a single generation went from living on a subsistence farm to a high-rise condo. And so they went from having 7 kids to 1 kid in 1 generation. The one-child policy was on top of that. And now that it's been more than 40 years, they don't have a lot of people aged under 40. There's no one left to have the next generation. So this was always going to be the last generation for the People's Republic. It was always going to be a 2-generation experience total. But it's happened so fast that we don't even have an economic theory developed. Humankind does not have an economic theory for what would allow the Chinese economy to function in 2030. It's that far gone. Especially when you're talking about demographics in China, we can only rely on the data we have. And with the Chinese now admitting publicly that it's all been fabricated, this fastest aging society in human history, that's the fabricated story. That's the best case scenario. The reality is significantly worse. And even if you believe the data on its face, Shanghai and Beijing already have the lowest birth rate of any metros in human history. So the pace of the disintegration here is really difficult to wrap your mind around. And I think disintegration is the word. We are looking at the end of China as a political entity within a decade or two, and as an economic entity within a decade. Wow. Whether or not the CCP survives that is an open question, because for the CCP, economic growth is no longer perceived as the path to legitimacy. So that the politics can go in a lot of weird directions. But let's talk about the country as a whole. It will not be able to hold together. It will not be able to fuel and feed itself. And in that sort of environment, the capacity of Beijing and the northern core to control all the outlying territories is absolutely going to come into question. Now, China has only existed as a unified entity for about 10% of its 3 millennia of history. It is usually fractured apart. And in situations where it has been together and then it's broken down, what usually happens is the northern zone turns into a famine-redded hellscape, where there's not energy, there's not food, there's a bit of a low-grade civil war, and the central government is desperate to oppress people into unity. And it's an ugly, ugly place to live. They'll probably lose half of their population. Then the southern cities from Shanghai on south, you're right, this is where the value add is. This is where the cosmopolitan is. This is where the bulk of the higher value-added manufacturing is. And this is where foreigners are more exposed and where we might actually feel it. If northern China were to vanish tomorrow, we might not notice. Those southern cities, that's the part that's internationally wired. So historically speaking, these cities become de facto independent city-states, and they interface with foreign countries and companies in order to access technology and finance and food. And then that's metabolized by local labor to participate in an international supply chain of some form. And then everything in the interior regresses. Xi spent his first 5 years purging the country of all of his political opponents. And then he spent his next 5 years purging the country of all theoretical opponents, which meant anyone who could think. There's nobody left. So yes, those institutions do exist to a degree, but they're either staffed by people who are utterly incompetent or patsies who got their job because of their personal loyalty. Even in Russia, which is not what we would call an information-free society, there are still a handful of people at the top that will talk to Putin and tell him uncomfortable truths. Now, 3 of them are competent. 3 of them are not. So he is getting a steady stream of misinformation and propaganda, but there are 3 people who will tell him the truth. Xi has nothing like that. If you remember Deng Xiaoping, he was the second-generation leader, the guy after Mao. He was probably the best leader that China has ever had, because he realized what the strengths and the weaknesses of the Chinese system were, and he worked a assiduously internationally to address the weaknesses and leverage the strengths. So he is the guy who met with Nixon and was brought into the American post-World War II, Cold War, international globalization structures. And that set the stage for the industrial expansion to create the China that we now know. And he wanted to make sure that they never had a repeat of Mao. So he personally selected not just his successor, but the following guy too. And that's Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao. Between the two of them, they ruled China for 20 years, and that has been the golden age of China. But he knew that he was not smart enough to figure out who should run the country 30 years on. And so he left it to those two factions to come up with a compromise candidate. And the compromise candidate was Xi Jinping. Unfortunately for Jiang and Hu, Xi spent his first 5 years outmaneuvering them and gutting both factions. And then the second 5-year period, getting rid of anyone who might theoretically form a new faction. And so if you remember when he crowned himself president for life about a year ago, Hu Jintao was up on one of the desks on stage when it all went on, and they publicly escorted him out to underscore to the country just how there was no opposing power center anywhere, even theoretically in China anymore. It's just Xi.
If you want to take down China, you're going to have to take down China. In fact, you're going to be in front. If you want any deal whatsoever, quit holding out for a multilateral one. That does not allow us to use our diplomatic, military, and economic leverage to the most. This is not the order. You cannot trade guns for butter. We can use guns, we can use butter, and we can use it to get whatever we want from you. But if you want any economic relationship with us, it's going to be a bilateral deal, not that we negotiate, that we impose. And Abi's like, oh, he clearly doesn't mean that, so I'm just going to keep stalling for time. And then all of a sudden, the Americans had a deal with South Korea and Mexico and Canada. And 4 of Japan's 5 largest trading partners were already part of this new post-order system. About a month later, the Japanese started their bilateral talks. They'll probably be finished up later this year. Wow, talk about somebody who's had a crappy last few months. Brexit was always going to end with a hard divorce. There was never going to be a deal. The way the European Union works, if there is ever a big issue, each individual member has veto power. And there is no version of a Brexit divorce agreement that could make Ireland and Spain and the Netherlands and Germany and France and the British Parliament happy. There's no way that this could go except for a hard Brexit, which means the United Kingdom is facing down an economic depression that's going to take 20% off of its headline GDP over the next 3 years. That is unavoidable. That is baked in. And those are the situations in which the United Kingdom is coming to the United States seeking a bilateral trade deal. Now, the last time Britain was in this situation, it was World War II. They were on the ropes versus the Nazis, and FDR got a call from Churchill. And Churchill says, look, if you're not going to get in this fight, at least give us some equipment. And FDR's like, we've got these old, super crappy destroyers that were obsolete when we floated them 25 years ago, that your sailors made fun of. You want those? And Churchill's like, I guess it's better than nothing. Yeah, sure, we'll take those. But they're not free. As payment, we'll take every single military base you have in the Western Hemisphere. Fine. What's the magic word? Please. And for the next 50 years, the United Kingdom was a strategic, subservient nation to the United States. We're going to do that again with this new trade deal because the Brits have no leverage. At a minimum, it's going to cost them the London Financial Center. Well, if there's a world leader out there that does not understand Donald Trump, it's Angela Merkel. She thought she could win him over with a history lesson. I'm like, oh, you did not study ahead for this one. She came in to explain that Germany is in the middle of the Northern European plain, which means that it's got rivals all around it. And the only way that the Germans have ever discovered that they can exist in that environment is to be better. Stronger infrastructure, better educational system, a more advanced workforce, a more sophisticated technological base. But you take anything as big as Germany and you make it as advanced as Germany, and its very existence threatens everyone around it. So European history is this horrible pendulum that swings between periods of extreme German strength which causes a pan-European alliance to tear them down in a war, and then extreme German weakness, where Central Europe becomes a black hole that sucks everyone in. And she says, Mr. President, do you realize that if you do what you say you're going to do, if you remove the security overwatch that allows us to get past our history and our geography, that that's not just the end of NATO and that's not just the end of the European Union, that's the end of my country? His response, well, I do now. She thought she could just educate him and that would be enough, and that he would continue doing what the United States had been doing for the last 70 years. She missed the transactional nature of American foreign policy beyond the order. So on her way out the door, Donald Trump gave her a parting gift, a bill for services rendered for defending Germany since the 1940s. For all intents and purposes, the American NATO, the American European, the American German relationship died that day, and we've just been going through the motions since. Folks, if the United States has a trade deal with Korea and Mexico and China and Japan and Britain, that's already half of our trade portfolio. That's the end of the Trump administration's ambitions for trade, because that's enough that the US can probably avoid a recession even if the global system burns. I know that's not great for people in this room in the short term, but in the long term, it's going to work really well. We'll get there in a minute. One more country. President Xi, when he finally had his summit last March, called ahead. And he said, I don't want to meet in the White House. I have things I need to say to you that I cannot say in front of the diplomatic corps and the press corps. So they diverted to Mar-a-Lago, where Trump could control the environment. And Xi laid it out. It's like, you control the global security environment, global finance, global energy, the market we have to have access to. We're in a tough time in China. We're financially over-leveraged. We're facing food crises. We're more dependent on you than we ever have been before. And we're in the midst of the most difficult political transition in modern Chinese history, from me to me. Please don't pull the rug out from under me right now. So let's talk about North Korea, about the South China Sea, about cybercrime, about the trade deficit. Let's talk about it all. And we made more progress in the next 11 months than we had in the past 20 years. Was it enough? Oh no, not even close. But it was interesting that Xi felt he had to tip his hand. And if you ever think you've had a bad day, consider President Xi, who has now admitted that the physical and economic security and continuity of his government, of his person, is entirely dependent upon the even-keeled mood of the man on the left. All right, let's talk ag. This is what it looks like outside right now. That's why we're all inside. This is actually really good for agriculture. Winter is one of the best things that can happen to temperate zone agriculture. It's a free bug kill, and it's a free soil regeneration phase for the soil. It's free fertilizer, free pesticide. That's not how it works in Brazil. Brazil's agricultural zone is an area called the Cerrado. It is a tropical prairie, and it has this kind of weird fibrous tree that kind of crowds out the roots of anything else. So if you want to farm the Cerrado, you have to take a bulldozer out there after it rains, chain up these trees, drag them out by the roots, and then spend the next 20 years poisoning the soil with a lime until you kill the acid. That leaves you with a soil that's the consistency and nutrient profile of beach sand, which means you have to put 3 and 4 times as much fertilizer per crop that you would here. Not to mention you can never let up with a pesticide because there's never a winter kill. It's the most expensive input cycle for agriculture anywhere in the world. Next problem is geography. This is an elevation map, and that kind of orangish butterfly down there at the bottom, those are mountains that are about the same high as the Appalachian chain. You'll notice in the middle of the butterfly, there's a break. That's the city of Sao Paulo. Think of Brazil like a table that has had 2 legs knocked out, but the high side is on the coast. So any product you ship can't use a navigable waterway. Brazil has none. It has to go by truck to the top of that escarpment and then zigzag down on switchbacks to the coast. Highest transport costs for agriculture in the world. That also changes the political system. Oh yeah, there's the one road. All soy exports, one road. Can you imagine? They get 200-mile traffic jams every harvest season. It's a disaster. Anyway, the social system. Now in the background there, you've got the Copacabana. You want to sip caipirinhas on the beach, this is where you go. But look at the foreground. Concrete block and plywood buildings. These are the favelas. These are Brazil's slums. The reason for the juxtaposition is pretty straightforward. There's so little in Brazil that is easy to develop that the only people who can become wealthy in Brazil are the people who started wealthy and had the money to put in the infrastructure and to terraform the land. Everyone else is dirt poor. This is the most unequal economy in the world and has been for 200 years. An idea from a different angle, how stark it is. Well, guess which industry this inequality problem is the strongest in? Ag. Their farms on average are 10 times the size of what they are in the United States, and we're not exactly known for having small farms here. There's no way for a small family farm to even survive, to even begin, because the capital costs are so high up front and continuing. Now, the Brazilians recently elected this dude. This is Bolsonaro. His big claim to fame from his campaign was talking about how the real problem with the Nazis is that they were just too soft on their foes. Won in a landslide. Go Brazil. Granted, he was running against a guy who was campaigning from prison where he'd been convicted of corruption. In Brazil, you can still campaign from prison. I just find that hilarious. Now, this guy is in league with the agriculturalists of Brazil, so expect the regulatory burden and expect a lot more slashing and clearing to happen in the rainforests as they finally have a friend in power. But if you combine the inequality of the system, and we're just on the verge of a global capital crunch, and there's only one road that takes all this stuff to market, this is how social revolutions happen. And since only one road takes it all, you only have to cut one road for Brazil to cease being an agricultural exporter. We are in the final years of you facing Brazil as a competitor.
You've got three main types. You've got your 10 nanometer and smaller. Those are your super advanced ones. Those are used in most AI programs. So that would include things like satellites. That would include things like self-driving. At the bottom, you've got your 90 nanometers and bigger. And these are almost analog chips. They can only do like one or two things. So like the chip that's in your smart bulbs would be one of those. And then in the middle, 90 to 10, everything else, that's the vast bulk of the market. And that's everything from aerospace to automotive to power regulation. And if a single country falls out of that constellation, none of it works because there is no backup for any of it.
Okay.
So if we do have a war in Taiwan that is meaningful in any way, we lose the good chips. And that means AI goes into a winter for at least a decade. The 90 and bigger, the dumb chips, those are almost exclusively China.
Okay.
So when China goes, no matter how China goes, we lose the Internet of Things and everything that comes from that. Everything in the middle is actually significantly more durable. The chips aren't as advanced. Their production comes from different places. There's some in Europe, there's some in Japan, there's some in South Korea, there's a lot in the United States. In fact, by value, the United States By value, the United States produces more chips than the rest of the world put together. Those were 10 nanometer and higher. Those are really expensive chips, but there's just not a lot of them. And the 90 nanometer and below, there's a lot of them, but they're just not very expensive. So everything in the middle for your cars, for your planes, and so on, we're probably okay with a China meltdown or even a Taiwanese capture or destruction. That doesn't mean it's immune to all the shocks that are going on out there. There's a lot, especially with the Ukraine war, I'm concerned about. But we're not really worried about the infrastructure or the industrial plant. And, you know, in this world, that's about as good as the news gets. We're going to be really good. I mean, we're pretty good now. We're already the world's largest economy, highest standard of living, energy secure, food secure, blah, 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 blah. 10 years from now, once we've built out the industrial plant to replace a lot of these places like China that are falling away, we're also going to have lower costs of production and more secure production and higher employment. And the employment here will be fueling the factories that are selling the products to the people who are consuming here, and will be broadly immune to international shocks. This is a good story.
Yeah.
But the path from here to there, yeah, there are a lot of bumps, and it is not straight. Sure. So let's deal with it first from the strategic point of view, and then we can deal with it from the economic point of view. So one of the things that the Europeans refused to admit is after the American Civil War with Reconstruction, while the United States was kind of off by its own, it was digesting a continent. And over the course of Reconstruction and knitting the country back together and conquering the West, we became not just the largest economy in the world. We were that before the Civil War. We became a larger economy than the British Empire, the French Empire, and the German Empire combined. And so when World War II came around, if you're willing to step back and ignore the emotion and just look at the numbers, there was no way that the war was going to win in any way other than American domination. And so once we got to 1944, and it was clear that the Soviets had broken the back of the Germans in the East, and that the Normandy and the Italian invasions were going to be successful, everyone realized it was time to prepare for what's next. And for most of the Europeans, they thought what's next was going to be an American empire that occupied Western Europe. And they were in the process of making their peace with that, because they realized they didn't have much of an option. Because if you were like Dane or Dutch, you were in exile. And so the deals that you cut when the Americans invited you to discuss the post-war system were going to determine the nature of your occupation. And in the opening speech, the United States made it very clear that was not what was up. We were going to create a fundamentally different system with the goal of making global war unthinkable. So in the world before World War II, it was imperial. Everyone had their own navy, everyone patrolled their own supply lines, everybody guarded them jealously, and everybody fought over the supply lines and the market access and the colonies. The American vision for the post-war environment would be that the U.S., which had a huge navy at that time, would patrol the global oceans for everyone so that anyone could go anywhere at any time and access any commodity and trade with any partner. And the real kicker was that the Americans would open their market first, because there wasn't a European market in the aftermath of the war. All you had to do was let us write your security policies, because we saw the world differently. It wasn't about economics for us. It was about security. We saw the Stalin-esque Soviet war machine rampaging through the East. We were getting reports from our intelligence that what the Soviets were doing in Ukraine and eventually in Poland was worse than what the Nazis had done in many ways, which was, mind-boggling. And we realized that there was no way that we, operating from a different continent, could fight that unless we had literally millions of bodies between us and the Red Army. And since the Europeans were coming out of the most destructive war in human history, they were in no position to do anything unless they could be properly incentivized. So the whole idea of globalization from the American point of view was to give the entire world an economic reason to stand up to Stalin. And it worked, because it used to be, well, globalization meant you didn't need all four. You just needed one. And you could trade for the others under American protection. And that literally created the world that we knew. From the American point of view, we think of this as containment, and it was. From the rest of the world's point of view, it was everyone getting on the road to civilization more or less at the same time. From different starting points, going at different speeds, but for the first time in history, we were all industrializing. And that changed everything. And that creates the environment that we're in today. They were invited, but when it became clear that it wasn't about Stalinist central control, their delegation broke down and left fairly shortly thereafter. A lot of the what we consider the Central European countries were there and did sign, but then they became Soviet bloc satellites and obviously didn't participate in the deals that happened on the backside. Think about the time difference between now and then. So, we are roughly 80 years from World War II now, roughly 70 years from the Korean War. Think about what was 70 and 80 years before World War II. You had all of the Franco-German wars. You had the rise of Imperial Germany. And so people knew in their bones that when a large country captured another country, it was theirs.
Yeah.
And this went a very different direction. The Brits came in with a plan for taking over the world again that the Americans were going to pay for.
Oh, no kidding.
So everyone had their preconceived notions. The Brits were just, wacko on that point. But, everyone's parents are a little odd when they get older.
Interesting.
But for everybody else, the question was, what are the American terms going to be? Because, why would they would they bring us to a off-season ski resort in the middle of nowhere if it wasn't just to grind into us just how little? One of the things with the Ukraine war now is we're discovering, and everyone discovered this in World War II and in World War I and in every war the Russians have ever been in. Year one is a disaster. And then in year two, the Russians mobilize and start throwing bodies at the problem. And by the time we got to Stalingrad, there were a lot of bodies being thrown. And in the assault going both east and especially west into Germany, the Russians were regularly suffering 4-to-1 casualty ratios, but they just kept coming. And when we realized that was going to be the nature of the fight post-Germany, the only way you stop the bodies in that number is with even more bodies. And since there were as many Soviets as there were Europeans, we needed everyone. Well, yeah, absolutely. So it's Russia, so data, who knows? But our best guess is that by the time we get to May, the Ukrainians will have brought in 60,000 fresh troops that have trained with NATO with new gear that will make it the toughest fighting force in Europe aside from the United States itself. And arguably, considering our force posture in Europe, maybe even tougher. But the Russians will have another 500,000 men in theater. And so you're talking about 600,000 to 700,000 Russians on the front compared to the 100,000 that they started with. So this is we're about to start the second chapter. This is a fundamentally different conflict now. Yeah, there's pros and cons if you're not Russian. I mean, if you're Russian, the numbers are pretty obvious. The cons is that's a lot of people, and Ukraine can only win this if it's a battle of movement where they can inflict 8-to-1 casualty ratios. And we've had a muddy winter. It hasn't gotten cold enough to freeze the ground. They haven't been able to move with their tanks at all. And so they've been stuck in these head-to-head battles in places like Bakhmut, where they're suffering casualties they can't afford. And in a battle where the Ukrainians kill 3 times as many Russians as they lose, that's a battle the Ukrainians lost. They need to get this up to at least 8-to-1 to have a chance. On the other side, by the end of this year, the Russians will have committed at least 100,000 men. We're already approaching 200,000 casualties, which probably means approaching 200,000 deaths because Russian battlefield triage and medical is atrocious. 1 million men have fled. There are 8 million men in their 20s in Russia. So 1 million is gone, not coming back. The other million is getting chopped up. That still leaves them 6 million to go, but this is Russia's last generation. So even if the Russians do manage to overwhelm Ukraine this year and start what will turn into the greatest genocide since World War II, this is going to take a lot of men, and this is the last conventional war that the Russians will be capable of fighting.